Karen Whitmore had exactly 11 seconds to decide whether to answer a phone call from a number she didn't recognize, and that single decision would unravel a secret her own family had been quietly protecting for 31 years. What she didn't know yet, standing in her kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, was that the voice on the other end of that call belonged to a man she had spent 3 decades believing was dead. And by the end of that phone call, everything she thought she understood about the night her mother saved her life would turn out to be only half the story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Karen Whitmore was 52 years old, a retired schoolteacher, a mother of 2 grown sons, and a woman who had built her entire adult life around a single memory she could barely recall on her own. When she was 6 years old, her family's station wagon slid off an icy bridge outside Columbus during a January storm, and sank into the freezing water below. Her mother, Ruth Whitmore, had always told her the same story every single year on the anniversary of that night. A stranger appeared out of nowhere, pulled Karen and her mother from the wreckage, wrapped them in his own coat, and vanished before the ambulance arrived, never giving his name, never asking for thanks, simply disappearing back into the storm as quickly as he had come. For 31 years, that stranger existed only as a shape in Karen's mind, a coat, a pair of strong hands, a voice telling her to keep her eyes open and keep breathing. Her mother passed away 4 years earlier, taking with her whatever details she had never shared, and Karen had long ago made peace with the idea that the man who saved her life would remain forever unnamed, a debt she could never repay because she didn't know who to repay it to. She had stopped actively wondering about him years ago, the way people eventually stop checking a door they know will never open. Which is exactly why the phone call on that Tuesday morning felt less like an answer and more like a ghost stepping directly into her kitchen. The man on the phone introduced himself as Walter Bardwell, 79 years old, calling from a nursing facility outside Marietta, Ohio, roughly 2 hours south of where Karen now lived. He told her, in a voice that shook slightly with age and something closer to nerves, that he believed he was the man who had pulled her and her mother from that river in 1993. Karen's first instinct was disbelief, the practical kind that comes from a lifetime of receiving strange calls and strange claims, but something in the specific details he offered, the make of the car, the exact bend in the road, the color of her mother's coat, made the skepticism drain out of her almost instantly. He remembered things no stranger could have simply guessed. What Walter told her next was the part her mother had never once mentioned in 31 years of retelling that story. He hadn't simply appeared out of nowhere that night. He had been following their car for nearly 6 miles before the accident happened, ever since he noticed the vehicle swerving erratically on the icy roads ahead of him. He wasn't a passing stranger who happened to be in the right place. He had made a decision, mile after mile, in a storm bad enough that most drivers had already pulled over, to keep his distance and stay close, just in case. When the car finally slid off the bridge, Walter was already less than 200 feet behind them, already reaching for his door handle before the vehicle had even fully stopped moving. Karen sat down slowly at her kitchen table as Walter continued, his voice growing steadier the longer he spoke, as though he had rehearsed this exact conversation 1,000 times in his head over 3 decades without ever expecting to actually have it. He told her that after pulling them both from the water, he carried her mother up the embankment first, then went back down for Karen, who by then had stopped crying and gone completely still, a detail that had haunted him for years afterward because stillness in a 6-year-old, he said, is far more frightening than screaming. He wrapped them both in his coat, flagged down a passing truck to call for help, and left before anyone could ask his name, not out of humility, but because of something he had never told another living soul until this phone call. Walter explained that he had been driving that night away from a hospital in Columbus, where his own daughter, 7 years old at the time, had died earlier that same evening after a long illness he refused to describe in detail. He had gotten in his car with no destination in mind, driving simply to keep from sitting still with his grief, when he noticed Karen's family car ahead of him on the icy road. Pulling 2 strangers from a frozen river that night, he admitted, had nothing to do with heroism in the way people imagined it. It was the only thing standing between him and a version of that night he did not believe he would have survived on his own. He never came forward afterward, he said, because he couldn't separate the two halves of that night in his own mind, the daughter he had just lost and the child he had just saved, and facing Karen's mother directly felt, at the time, like something he did not have the right to do. So he drove home in wet clothes, told no one, and carried the entire night alone for years, moving through small towns across southern Ohio, working as a long-haul truck driver, never marrying again, never having other children, until age and failing health finally caught up with him in a nursing facility with too much quiet time and too many old memories with nowhere left to go. What finally pushed him to make the call, he told her, was a newspaper clipping a nurse had shown him almost by accident, an old feature story about Karen's mother published years earlier, in which Ruth Whitmore had described the anonymous stranger from that January night in exact, careful detail, still hoping, even decades later, that he might somehow read it and recognize himself. Walter had kept that clipping folded in his nightstand drawer for 2 years before finally asking a nurse to help him track down a phone number, terrified the entire time that Karen might not want to hear from him at all, that some doors, once left closed for 31 years, are better left that way. Karen didn't hesitate. Within the week, she drove the 2 hours to Marietta by herself, sitting in a small visiting room with a man who had spent 3 decades convinced that the kindest thing he ever did was also the thing he was least entitled to claim credit for. She brought with her the only photograph her mother had ever kept from that winter, a blurry image of a coat draped over 2 shivering figures on the riverbank, taken by a passing motorist before the ambulance arrived, a photograph Karen had looked at 1,000 times without ever imagining she would one day sit across from the man wearing that exact coat. Walter Bardwell passed away 8 months after that first visit, but not before Karen brought her own children to meet him twice more, not before he was finally, after 31 years, allowed to hear a grown woman say the words he never believed he deserved to hear, "Thank you for staying close enough to catch us." At his small funeral outside Marietta, Karen stood exactly where a daughter would have stood, because in every way that mattered by then, she was the closest thing to family he had left, and she made certain his name, finally, after 3 decades of silence, was spoken out loud. This story is a reminder that the people who quietly change the direction of our entire lives are sometimes carrying their own private storm at the exact moment they choose to show up for ours, and that gratitude delayed by 31 years can still, somehow, arrive exactly on time. If there is someone in your own life you've been meaning to thank properly and never have, do not wait for a phone call from a stranger to make you brave enough. Write it down tonight, mail it tomorrow, and let this be the year that particular silence finally ends.